The rain drummed steadily against the windshield as Sarah Williams drove through the quiet suburban streets of Millbrook. She had just finished a long day at the courthouse, successfully defending her client in a complicated civil rights case. Her briefcase sat in the passenger seat, filled with legal documents and case files that represented months of preparation. The victory felt sweet, but exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. Sarah adjusted her rearview mirror and noticed she was still wearing her courtroom attire, a sharp navy blazer and matching skirt that commanded respect in any legal setting. At 34, she had worked tirelessly to build her reputation as one of the city's most skilled civil rights attorneys. Her law degree from Harvard hung proudly in her downtown office, alongside numerous awards and recognitions for her community service. The traffic light ahead turned yellow, and Sarah slowed her black sedan to a gentle stop. She reached for her phone to call her husband Marcus and let him know she would be home soon for dinner. Their twin daughters, Emma and Grace, were probably already asking when Mommy would return. The thought brought a warm smile to her face despite the long day. As she waited for the light to change, Sarah noticed a police cruiser pull up behind her. She thought nothing of it initially. Police cars were common on these streets. The light turned green, and she proceeded forward at the posted speed limit of 35 miles per hour. She had always been a careful driver, never receiving so much as a parking ticket in her 15 years of driving. Officer David Mitchell sat in his patrol car, his eyes fixed on the vehicle ahead. At 42, he had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 18 years. His record was filled with commendations, but lately his judgment had become clouded by personal frustrations and deep-seated prejudices that he rarely acknowledged even to himself. Mitchell noticed the expensive car and the well-dressed black woman behind the wheel. His mind began to wander, making assumptions about how someone like her could afford such a vehicle. These thoughts, rooted in harmful stereotypes, started to consume his rational thinking. He had been having a particularly stressful month. His divorce was becoming messy. His teenage son barely spoke to him, and his supervisor had been questioning some of his recent reports. Without any legitimate reason, Mitchell decided to follow the sedan more closely. He looked for any minor infraction that might justify a traffic stop, but Sarah was driving perfectly. She used her turn signals, maintained proper speed, and kept a safe distance from other vehicles. Still, something inside Mitchell pushed him to find a reason to pull her over. Sarah noticed the police car was now following her more closely than seemed normal. She checked her speedometer again. She was driving exactly the speed limit. Her hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as a familiar feeling of unease crept in. As a black woman, she had heard too many stories about routine traffic stops that went wrong. She had even represented clients who had been victims of police misconduct. She made a right turn onto Oak Street, the police car still behind her. Her heart rate began to increase, though she tried to stay calm. Sarah reminded herself that she had done nothing wrong. She was a respected member of the community, a successful attorney, and a law-abiding citizen. Surely this officer would have no reason to stop her. Officer Mitchell watched as the sedan turned onto Oak Street. He made the same turn, his decision becoming firmer with each passing moment. He convinced himself that something seemed suspicious about the situation, though he could not articulate what that might be. The expensive car, the confident posture of the driver, the neighborhood she was traveling through, his biased mind created a narrative that had no basis in reality. As they continued down Oak Street, Sarah began to feel increasingly uncomfortable. The police car remained close behind her, and she could see the officer in her rearview mirror. She thought about calling her husband but decided against it, hoping the situation would resolve itself. She had about 10 more minutes until she reached her neighborhood. Mitchell finally made his decision. He reached for his radio and called in the traffic stop, though he still had not witnessed any traffic violation. He activated his emergency lights, the red and blue flashing beams cutting through the evening dimness. His heart pounded as he prepared to approach the vehicle, his hand instinctively moving toward his service weapon. Sarah saw the flashing lights and felt her stomach drop. She carefully pulled over to the side of the road, her hands shaking slightly as she put the car in park. She took a deep breath and tried to center herself, knowing that the next few minutes could be crucial. She placed both hands on the steering wheel where they would be clearly visible and waited for the officer to approach. The quiet suburban street suddenly felt very different. A few neighbors peered out their windows, curious about the police activity. Sarah's mind raced through everything she knew about her rights during a traffic stop, while Officer Mitchell stepped out of his cruiser, his own assumptions and prejudices about to collide with a reality he never expected. Officer Mitchell approached the driver's side window with deliberate steps, his hand resting on his duty belt. The evening air was cool and damp from the recent rain, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. He had already formed opinions about this traffic stop before even speaking to the driver, his mind clouded by the same prejudices that had been growing stronger over the past few months. Sarah kept her hands visible on the steering wheel and watched in her side mirror as the officer approached. She had been in this situation before, not personally, but through the stories of countless clients who had experienced similar encounters. Her legal training kicked in, reminding her to remain calm, cooperative, and to document everything she could remember later. Mitchell tapped on the window with his knuckles, perhaps more forcefully than necessary. Sarah rolled down the window slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. The officer leaned down slightly, his face stern and unwelcoming. At first glance, he saw exactly what he expected to see: a well-dressed black woman in an expensive car, and his preconceived notions filled in the rest of the story for him. "License and registration," Mitchell demanded without any greeting or explanation for the stop. His tone was harsh and commanding, lacking the professional courtesy that should characterize police interactions with law-abiding citizens. He did not explain what violation had prompted the stop because there had been none. "Officer, may I ask why you stopped me?" Sarah asked politely, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She had learned long ago that knowledge of her rights was her best protection, but she also knew that exercising those rights as a black woman could be dangerous. Mitchell's expression hardened. He interpreted her reasonable question as defiance rather than the legitimate inquiry it was. "I asked for your license and registration. Are you going to comply, or do we have a problem here?" His voice carried an implicit threat that made Sarah's chest tighten with anxiety. Sarah reached slowly for her purse, announcing each movement to avoid any misunderstandings. "I'm reaching for my license in my purse," she said clearly. Her hands trembled slightly as she retrieved her wallet. The Massachusetts driver's license showed her full name, Sarah Elizabeth Williams, along with her address in the affluent Beacon Hill neighborhood. As she handed over the license, Mitchell barely glanced at it before demanding the registration. Sarah leaned toward the glove compartment, again announcing her movements. "I'm reaching for the registration in the glove compartment." The document showed the car was legally registered in her name and was current on all inspections and fees. Mitchell studied the documents with exaggerated attention, though his mind was already made up about the narrative he wanted to believe. The address on the license was in one of the city's most expensive neighborhoods, and the car was clearly costly. Instead of recognizing that Sarah was obviously a successful professional, his biased thinking led him to assume something illicit must be involved. "This your car?" Mitchell asked suspiciously, holding the registration as if it might be fake. "Yes, officer. It's registered in my name, as you can see," Sarah replied, maintaining her composure despite the increasingly hostile tone of the interaction. She could see that this officer had already decided something negative about her, regardless of the facts. Mitchell walked back to his patrol car, taking the documents with him. Sarah watched in her mirror as he sat in the driver's seat, presumably running her information through the police database. She knew the search would reveal nothing negative. She had never been arrested, never received a traffic ticket, and had a spotless record. Her hands remained on the steering wheel, but her mind was racing. During the long minutes that Mitchell spent in his car, Sarah began to think about her daughters. Emma and Grace were only 8 years old, and she had been trying to shield them from the harsh realities of racism and prejudice. How could she explain to them that their mother, a successful lawyer who helped people fight for their rights, could be treated with such suspicion and hostility simply because of the color of her skin? The database search confirmed everything Sarah knew it would. Her record was completely clean. No arrests, no warrants, no traffic violations. The car registration was legitimate, her driver's license was valid, and everything was in perfect order. A reasonable officer would have apologized for the mistake and sent her on her way. But Officer Mitchell was not being reasonable. When faced with evidence that contradicted his assumptions, he doubled down instead of reconsidering his position. He convinced himself that the clean record might be suspicious in itself, or that perhaps she was involved in something that simply had not been discovered yet. His prejudice was stronger than the facts in front of him. Mitchell returned to Sarah's window, his attitude unchanged despite the clean background check. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his hand moving back toward his service weapon in a gesture clearly meant to intimidate. Sarah's heart rate spiked. She knew that traffic stops should not typically require a driver to exit the vehicle unless there was a specific safety concern or evidence of wrongdoing. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong. Could you please tell me why you stopped me in the first place?" "Step out of the vehicle now or I'll remove you myself," Mitchell threatened, his voice rising. A few more neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some took out their phones, sensing that something was wrong with this interaction. Sarah made a difficult decision. She could stand on her rights and refuse to exit the vehicle without proper justification, but she also knew that escalating the situation could put her in physical danger. As a civil rights lawyer, she had seen too many cases where asserting constitutional rights had led to violence, particularly for people of color. "I'm complying under protest," Sarah said clearly, hoping that any witnesses would hear her words. She opened the car door slowly and stepped onto the wet pavement, her professional attire and dignified bearing creating a stark contrast with the officer's aggressive behavior. The scene that was unfolding on Oak Street was being witnessed by several neighbors, some of whom began recording with their phones. They could see that something was wrong. The well-dressed woman appeared calm and cooperative, while the police officer seemed agitated and hostile without apparent justification. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal truths neither participant expected. Sarah stood beside her vehicle in the cool evening air, her professional attire now feeling like armor against the hostile treatment she was receiving. Officer Mitchell circled around her car like a predator, looking through the windows and examining the exterior as if expecting to find evidence of some crime. His behavior was becoming more erratic and aggressive with each passing moment. "Put your hands on the hood," Mitchell commanded, his voice carrying an edge that suggested he was hoping for resistance. Sarah complied, placing her palms flat against the cool metal of her car. The position was humiliating and unnecessary, but she knew that any refusal could escalate the situation dangerously. Several neighbors had now gathered on their porches and front steps, drawn by the unusual commotion on their typically quiet street. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly white woman who lived directly across from where the stop was taking place, stood on her front porch with her phone in hand, recording the interaction. She had lived in this neighborhood for 40 years and had never seen a police officer behave so aggressively. During a routine traffic stop, Mitchell began what he called a search for officer safety, though he had no reasonable suspicion that Sarah posed any threat. She stood perfectly still as he roughly patted down her blazer and checked her pockets, his hands lingering longer than necessary in a way that felt more like harassment than legitimate police work. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to maintain her composure, knowing that any reaction could be used against her. "What's in the briefcase?" Mitchell demanded, pointing to the leather case visible through the passenger window. "Legal documents from my work," Sarah replied honestly. "I'm an attorney." Mitchell let out a derisive laugh that carried clear racial undertones. "Sure you are. And I'm the mayor of Boston." His skepticism was rooted not in any evidence, but in his inability to accept that a black woman could hold such a prestigious profession. The officer retrieved the briefcase from the car and set it on the hood next to where Sarah's hands were placed. "Open it," he ordered. Sarah hesitated for a moment, knowing that her client's confidential files were inside, but ultimately decided that compliance was safer than resistance. Inside the briefcase were neatly organized legal documents, case files, business cards from the law firm Williams & Associates, and her Massachusetts Bar Association membership card. There were also court filings with official seals, correspondence with other attorneys, and research materials related to civil rights law. Any reasonable person would have immediately recognized these as the legitimate materials of a practicing attorney. Mitchell rifled through the papers carelessly, his hands leaving fingerprints on important legal documents. He seemed frustrated that he was not finding whatever evidence he had expected to discover. The business cards clearly identified Sarah as a partner in a prestigious downtown law firm, and her bar card proved her standing as a licensed attorney in good standing. "These could be fake," Mitchell muttered, Though the documents were clearly authentic and bore official seals and letterheads, he was so committed to his preconceived narrative that he was willing to dismiss obvious evidence that contradicted his assumptions. Mrs. Henderson called out from her porch, "Officer, that woman hasn't done anything wrong. Why are you treating her like this?" Her voice carried the authority of someone who had lived in the community for decades and was respected by her neighbors. Mitchell spun around angrily. "Ma'am, stay back and mind your own business. This is police work." His defensive response revealed that he knew his behavior was inappropriate, even as he continued down the same path. By now, nearly a dozen neighbors had gathered, and several were recording the interaction with their phones. They could all see that something was terribly wrong with this traffic stop. The woman appeared professional, calm and cooperative, while the officers seemed to be looking for trouble where none existed. Sarah remained silent during this exchange, but her mind was working furiously. She recognized that this situation had moved far beyond a simple traffic stop and had become something much more serious. As a civil rights attorney, she had represented clients in similar situations, but experiencing it firsthand was entirely different. The powerlessness was overwhelming, even for someone who knew the law as well as she did. Mitchell continued his search of the vehicle, looking under seats and in compartments where no traffic-related evidence would be found. He seemed to be buying time, perhaps hoping that something would justify his actions retroactively. In the back seat, he found a small gift bag containing coloring books and crayons that Sarah had purchased for her daughters. "Whose are these?" he asked suspiciously, as if children's art supplies might somehow be contraband. "My daughters," Sarah replied softly. "They're 8 years old." For just a moment, something flickered across Mitchell's face. Perhaps a recognition that he was dealing with a mother, a professional, a human being rather than the criminal stereotype his prejudices had created. But the moment passed quickly and his hostility returned. Mitchell's radio crackled to life. His supervisor, Sergeant Rodriguez, was asking for a status update on the traffic stop that had been ongoing for nearly 20 minutes. Most routine stops were completed in 5 to 10 minutes, and the extended duration was raising questions at the station. "Unit 47, what's your status on the Oak Street stop?" the radio called. Mitchell hesitated before responding. He realized that he would have to explain his actions to his supervisor, and he had no legitimate justification for anything he had done. There had been no traffic violation, no reasonable suspicion, and no evidence of wrongdoing. His entire interaction with Sarah had been based on prejudice rather than police work. "Still investigating, Sarge," Mitchell replied into his radio, though both he and Sarah knew there was nothing to investigate. Sarah looked up from her position against the car and made eye contact with several of the neighbors who were watching and recording. She saw something in their faces, recognition that an injustice was taking place, and perhaps a growing understanding of what it meant to be treated differently because of the color of one's skin. The situation had reached a critical point. Mitchell knew he could not justify his actions much longer, but his pride and prejudice prevented him from simply admitting his mistake and letting Sarah go. The community was watching, his supervisor was asking questions, and the evidence of Sarah's identity and respectability was mounting. Something had to give, and the resolution would come sooner than either of them expected. The tension on Oak Street reached a breaking point when a second police cruiser pulled up behind Officer Mitchell's vehicle. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez stepped out, her expression serious as she took in the scene before her. She had received multiple calls from concerned citizens reporting what appeared to be police harassment, and the extended duration of the traffic stop had raised red flags back at the station. Rodriguez was a 20-year veteran of the force and had earned respect through her fair and professional approach to law enforcement. As she walked toward the scene, she noticed the gathering crowd of neighbors, the cell phone cameras recording, and the obvious tension in Mitchell's body language. Her experienced eyes immediately recognized that something had gone very wrong. "Officer Mitchell, step back," Rodriguez commanded in a tone that left no room for argument. She had supervised Mitchell for 3 years and had noticed troubling patterns in his behavior, particularly in his interactions with minority citizens. This situation appeared to be the culmination of concerns she had been harboring for months. Sarah remained in position against her car, but felt a wave of relief as the supervisor arrived. She had learned through her legal work that supervisors often brought more professionalism to volatile situations, and she hoped this woman might be more reasonable than the officer who had stopped her. Rodriguez approached Sarah with a completely different demeanor than Mitchell had displayed. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Rodriguez. Can you please tell me what happened here tonight?" Sarah straightened up, grateful to finally be treated with basic human dignity. "I was driving home from work when Officer Mitchell began following me closely. He pulled me over, but he hasn't told me what violation I committed. I've been cooperative throughout this entire interaction." Rodriguez picked up Sarah's driver's license and registration from Mitchell's patrol car, studying them carefully. The address showed Sarah lived in one of the city's most prestigious neighborhoods, and her clean driving record was immediately visible on the computer screen. More importantly, Rodriguez noticed something that Mitchell had apparently missed entirely. The name Sarah Williams was familiar to Rodriguez, not from any criminal context but from local news coverage and community events. Sarah Williams was a prominent civil rights attorney who had successfully represented several police misconduct cases against the city. She was also a frequent speaker at community forums about police-community relations and had been featured in the local newspaper. For her pro bono work with underprivileged clients, Rodriguez felt her stomach drop as the full implications of the situation became clear. Not only had Mitchell conducted an unlawful traffic stop based on apparent racial profiling, but he had targeted one of the city's most visible advocates for police reform. The political and legal consequences would be severe, but more importantly, Rodriguez was genuinely disturbed by the injustice that had occurred. "Officer Mitchell, return to your vehicle immediately," Rodriguez ordered. She wanted to separate him from Sarah while she assessed the full scope of what had happened. Mitchell's face showed confusion and frustration, but he reluctantly complied with his supervisor's direct order. Rodriguez turned back to Sarah, her expression showing genuine concern and embarrassment. "Ms. Williams, I sincerely apologize for this interaction. You're free to go, and I want to assure you that this matter will be investigated thoroughly." The use of her name surprised Sarah momentarily, until she realized that her reputation in the legal community had preceded her. This recognition brought both relief and additional concern. If this was how a well-known attorney was treated, what happened to ordinary citizens who lacked her visibility and resources? "Sergeant, I need to know what justification Officer Mitchell had for this stop," Sarah said firmly, her professional instincts taking over now that she felt safer. "I was not speeding. I used proper signals and I committed no traffic violations. This appears to have been a pretextual stop based on racial profiling." Rodriguez nodded gravely. "You're absolutely right, and I take full responsibility for ensuring this is addressed appropriately. Would you be willing to file a formal complaint?" Sarah looked around at the neighbors who had witnessed the entire interaction, many still recording with their phones. She thought about her daughters and the lesson this situation represented. She could quietly accept the apology and go home, or she could use this moment to fight for systemic change that might prevent other families from experiencing similar treatment. "Yes, I'll be filing a complaint," Sarah said without hesitation. "But more than that, I want to understand how this happened and what the department is doing to prevent it from happening to others." Mitchell sat in his patrol car, watching the conversation between his supervisor and Sarah through his rearview mirror. For the first time since the stop began, he was starting to understand the magnitude of his mistake. The sight of his sergeant treating Sarah with respect and professionalism created a stark contrast with his own behavior, forcing him to confront the reality of his actions. Mrs. Henderson approached the group cautiously. "Sergeant, I've lived on this street for 40 years and I've never seen an officer behave like that. This woman was nothing but respectful and cooperative, and he treated her like a criminal for no reason at all." Other neighbors began speaking up, their voices creating a chorus of support for Sarah and condemnation of Mitchell's actions. They described what they had witnessed: the aggressive approach, the unnecessary search, the dismissive attitude toward Sarah's professional credentials, and the clear racial hostility that had characterized the entire interaction. Rodriguez documented each witness statement carefully, knowing that the investigation would require thorough testimony from everyone who had observed the incident. The community's response was unprecedented. She had never seen so many residents voluntarily come forward to support someone during a police encounter. As the immediate crisis de-escalated, Sarah began to process the full emotional impact of what had occurred. Despite her professional experience with similar cases, Being on the receiving end of discriminatory treatment was traumatic in ways she had not fully anticipated. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she felt the weight of explaining this experience to her young daughters. Rodriguez completed her preliminary investigation and returned Sarah's documents. "Ms. Williams, I want to personally ensure that you get home safely tonight. Officer Mitchell will be suspended pending a full investigation, and I'll be in contact with you tomorrow about the formal complaint process." Sarah nodded appreciatively, but her lawyer instincts were already working. "Sergeant, I hope you understand that this isn't just about one officer or one incident. This is about systemic issues that need to be addressed at a departmental level." "I understand completely," Rodriguez replied, "and I hope you'll consider working with us to make those changes happen." As Sarah finally drove away from Oak Street, she carried with her not just the trauma of the experience, but also a renewed determination to fight for justice. Officer Mitchell remained in his patrol car, beginning to grasp that his actions would have consequences that extended far beyond this single evening. The community had witnessed something important, and the conversation about police accountability was about to become very personal for everyone involved. The next morning, Officer David Mitchell sat across from Chief Patricia Coleman in her downtown office, feeling like his entire world was crashing down around him. The preliminary investigation report lay open on the desk between them, documenting witness statements, video evidence from neighbors' phones, and Sergeant Rodriguez's detailed account of the previous evening's events. Chief Coleman was a respected leader who had worked hard to rebuild community trust after several high-profile incidents of police misconduct in recent years. She had implemented new training programs, revised departmental policies, and personally worked to establish better relationships with community leaders. Mitchell's actions threatened to undo years of progress in a single evening. "David, help me understand what happened out there," Chief Coleman said, her voice stern but controlled. She had known Mitchell for his entire career and had always considered him a competent officer, which made the situation even more disappointing. Mitchell struggled to find words that could justify his behavior. In the cold light of day, removed from the emotions and prejudices that had driven his actions, he was beginning to see the situation clearly for the first time. Every decision he had made the previous evening appeared increasingly indefensible. "Chief, I thought something seemed suspicious about the situation," Mitchell began weakly, but even as he spoke the words, he knew how inadequate they sounded. "Suspicious how?" Coleman pressed. "Ms. Williams was driving a legally registered vehicle, had a clean record, and committed no traffic violations. What exactly was suspicious about a successful attorney driving home from work?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, forcing Mitchell to confront the uncomfortable truth about his motivations. He had stopped Sarah Williams because she was a black woman in an expensive car, and he had assumed something illicit must be involved. The realization was crushing, not just professionally but personally. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah sat in her law office reviewing the events of the previous evening with her legal partner, James Rodriguez, Sergeant Rodriguez's cousin and a fellow civil rights attorney. The irony of the family connection was not lost on either of them, and it provided an additional layer of complexity to the situation. "Sarah, you have grounds for a significant civil rights lawsuit," James said, reviewing the preliminary evidence: unlawful detention, racial profiling, violation of your Fourth Amendment rights. The case practically makes itself. Sarah nodded, but her thoughts were focused on broader implications. "James, I don't want this to just be about one lawsuit or one officer. This is an opportunity to address systemic problems that affect our entire community." She had spent a difficult night explaining the situation to her daughters, Emma and Grace. Their innocent questions about why a police officer would treat their mother badly had broken Sarah's heart, but it also strengthened her resolve to fight for change that might prevent other children from having similar conversations with their parents. Back at police headquarters, Chief Coleman was conducting a broader review of Mitchell's recent cases. What she found was troubling: a pattern of disproportionate stops involving minority drivers, aggressive tactics in situations that called for de-escalation, and complaints from community members that had been inadequately addressed. "David, I'm seeing a pattern here that goes beyond last night," Coleman said, spreading several case files across her desk. "Your stop rates for Black and Hispanic drivers are significantly higher than department averages, and your use of force incidents have increased over the past year. Mitchell looked at the evidence in front of him and felt a wave of shame wash over him. He had always thought of himself as a fair police officer, but the data told a different story. His personal problems, the divorce, the financial stress, the custody battles, had poisoned his professional judgment and led him down a path of discriminatory policing. The phone on Coleman's desk rang, interrupting their conversation. It was the mayor's office calling about the incident that was already making waves in the local media. Cell phone videos from the previous evening had been shared on social media, and the story was gaining traction as an example of the ongoing problems with police-community relations. "This is bigger than just our department now," David, Coleman said after ending the call. "The community is watching, the media is involved, and we need to show that we take accountability seriously." At that same moment, Sarah was meeting with community leaders and activists who had long been advocating for police reform. The conference room at her law office was filled with representatives from various civil rights organizations, neighborhood groups, and concerned citizens who saw this incident as a catalyst for broader change. "This isn't just about what happened to me," Sarah addressed the group. "This is about creating lasting change that protects everyone in our community. We need comprehensive reform, not just individual accountability." The group began planning a multifaceted approach that would include legal action, community organizing, policy advocacy, and public education. They wanted to use Sarah's case as a springboard for addressing systemic issues that had plagued police-community relations for years. Back in Chief Coleman's office, Mitchell was beginning to understand the full scope of his actions. He was not just facing disciplinary action, he was confronting the reality that his prejudices had caused real harm to an innocent person and had damaged the relationship between his department and the community they served. "Chief, I want to make this right," Mitchell said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how, but I want to fix what I've done." Coleman studied him carefully. She had seen officers make similar statements before, some genuinely remorseful and others simply trying to minimize their punishment. Mitchell's body language and emotional state suggested genuine regret, but words alone would not be enough. "David, making this right isn't going to be simple or easy," Coleman replied. "You've violated department policy, broken the law, and damaged community trust. Those are serious consequences that require serious responses." The conversation was interrupted by another call, this time from Sarah's law firm. They were formally requesting all records related to Mitchell's interactions with minority drivers over the past 3 years, along with his training records and performance evaluations. The legal machinery was beginning to move, and the consequences of that evening on Oak Street were about to become very real for everyone involved. As the day progressed, both Sarah and Mitchell found themselves at the center of a situation that was much larger than either of them had initially realized. For Sarah, it was an opportunity to fight for the systemic changes she had long advocated. For Mitchell, it was a reckoning with the prejudices that had guided his actions and destroyed his career. The community was watching, the media was reporting, and the wheels of justice were beginning to turn. The events of one evening had set in motion a series of consequences that would affect not just the two main participants, but the entire relationship between the police department and the community it served. The stage was set for a resolution that would test everyone's commitment to justice, accountability, and meaningful change. 6 months after that fateful evening on Oak Street, Officer David Mitchell sat in a community center classroom, facing a group of high school students as part of his court-mandated community service. He had been terminated from the police department, completed sensitivity training, and was now working to rebuild his life, while making amends for his actions. The federal civil rights lawsuit that Sarah Williams had filed against him and the department had been settled for a significant sum, but more importantly, it had led to comprehensive reforms in police training and accountability procedures. Mitchell's case had become a catalyst for change that extended far beyond one officer's misconduct. "Can anyone tell me what implicit bias means?" Mitchell asked the students, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. These educational sessions were part of his rehabilitation, but they had also become a genuine passion as he worked to prevent others from making the same mistakes he had. A young black student raised her hand. "It means having prejudices you don't even realize you have, right?" Mitchell nodded. "That's exactly right. and I'm here because I let my implicit biases control my actions instead of following my training and treating everyone fairly." The words were difficult to say, but he had learned that acknowledging his mistakes was the first step toward making meaningful change. Across town, Sarah Williams stood before the city council, presenting the final report from the Police Reform Commission that had been established in response to her case. The commission's recommendations were comprehensive, addressing everything from hiring practices to community oversight to officer wellness programs. The reforms we're proposing aren't just about preventing future incidents like the one I experienced, Sarah told the packed council chambers. They're about building a police department that truly serves and protects all members of our community. The room was filled with community members, police officers and city officials who had been working together for months to create meaningful change. The process had not always been easy, but it had brought different groups together in ways that previous reform efforts had failed to achieve. Chief Coleman, who had maintained her position by demonstrating strong leadership during the crisis, announced the implementation of new policies that included mandatory bias training, community policing initiatives, and a civilian oversight board with real authority to investigate complaints. "We've learned that accountability isn't just about punishing officers who make mistakes," Coleman explained to the council. "It's about creating systems that support good policing and prevent problems before they occur." The changes were already showing results. Complaint numbers had decreased, community relations had improved, and officers were reporting better job satisfaction under the new policies. The department had also hired more diverse officers and promoted several women and minorities to leadership positions. In the audience, Mrs. Henderson sat with several of her neighbors from Oak Street. They had become unlikely activists in the wake of witnessing Sarah's treatment, organizing neighborhood meetings and advocating for police reform. Their involvement demonstrated how individual incidents could mobilize entire communities when people were willing to speak up for what was right. Mitchell's journey had been particularly difficult. Losing his job had forced him to confront not only his financial problems, but also the deep-seated prejudices that had destroyed his career. The divorce proceedings had been finalized, but his relationship with his teenage son had actually improved as Mitchell worked through his issues with a counselor. "Dad, I'm proud of what you're doing now," his son Jake had told him recently. "It takes courage to admit you were wrong and try to fix it." Those words meant more to Mitchell than any commendation he had received during his police career. He was working as a security guard while pursuing a degree in social work, hoping to channel his desire to help people in a more positive direction. The community education program where Mitchell volunteered had become highly successful, with requests from schools throughout the region. His story served as a powerful example of how people could change when confronted with the consequences of their actions and provided with proper support. Sarah's law practice had grown significantly in the months following the incident. She had been flooded with requests from other victims of police misconduct, but she had also seen an increase in police departments asking for her help in developing better training programs and policies. "The goal isn't to be anti-police," Sarah explained to a group of new police recruits during one of her training sessions. "The goal is to help officers understand the communities they serve and build relationships based on mutual respect and trust." Her daughters, Emma and Grace, had become more aware of social justice issues through their mother's experience. They often accompanied Sarah to community events and had started their own small advocacy group at school, teaching other children about fairness and equality. The evening on Oak Street had changed everyone it touched. The neighbors who had witnessed the incident had become more engaged in community affairs, attending city council meetings and participating in police community dialogues. They had learned that being passive bystanders was not enough when injustice occurred. 1 year after the incident, Sarah and Mitchell found themselves in the same room for the first time since that night. It was at a police reform conference where Sarah was the keynote speaker, and Mitchell was participating in a panel about officer rehabilitation and second chances. After the formal presentations ended, Mitchell approached Sarah during the networking break. His hands trembled slightly as he walked toward her, knowing this conversation had been inevitable but dreading it nonetheless. "Ms. Williams," he said quietly, "I know this doesn't change anything, but I need you to know how deeply sorry I am for what I put you through that night." Sarah studied his face carefully. seeing genuine remorse and the toll that the past year had taken on him. As an attorney, she had seen many defendants express regret in court, but this felt different. Mitchell's transformation appeared to be real and substantial. "Officer Mitchell," she replied, using his former title deliberately. "I appreciate your apology, but more important than your words are your actions. From what I've heard, you're doing meaningful work to prevent others from experiencing what I went through." Mitchell nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "It's the least I can do. I destroyed your evening, I hurt your family, and I damaged trust between the police and the community. I can't undo that, but I can spend the rest of my life trying to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." Their conversation continued for several minutes, witnessed by conference attendees who recognized the significance of the moment. Here was a victim of police misconduct and the officer who had wronged her, finding a way to move forward that served the broader cause of justice and reform. The local newspaper covered their interaction, with photographs showing Sarah and Mitchell shaking hands and discussing their shared commitment to police reform. The image became symbolic of the possibility for reconciliation and positive change, even after serious wrongdoing. As the conference ended and participants returned to their home communities, the ripple effects of that evening on Oak Street continued to spread. Police departments in other cities began implementing similar reforms. Community groups organized their own oversight initiatives, and individuals like Mitchell shared their stories to help others recognize and overcome their own biases. Sarah returned home that evening to find Emma and Grace working on a school project about civil rights heroes. They had chosen to write about their mother, not because of what had happened to her, but because of how she had used that experience to create positive change for others. "Mom," Emma asked as Sarah helped with the project, "do you think Officer Mitchell is a good person now?" Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "I think Officer Mitchell is a person who made serious mistakes but is working hard to learn from them and help others. People can change when they're willing to do the difficult work of examining themselves and making amends." The story that began with prejudice and injustice on a quiet suburban street had evolved into something more hopeful, a testament to the possibility of growth, redemption, and meaningful change when communities come together to demand better from their institutions and from each other. Mitchell continued his community service work. Sarah expanded her advocacy efforts, and the city continued implementing reforms that made it a model for police-community relations. The evening that had started with such pain and injustice had ultimately become a catalyst for the kind of positive change that both the community and law enforcement desperately needed. In the end, the true measure of justice was not just in the consequences that Mitchell faced for his actions, but in the lasting improvements that emerged from the crisis, improvements that would protect countless future families from experiencing the fear and humiliation that Sarah Williams had endured on that rainy evening on Oak Street.